Discouragement. Discouragement. It happens to all of us at different points in our lives. There's a lot of different things that can cause discouragement in our lives. And those things seemingly and generally so grow in size as we grow older. The things that we're discouraged about as a young person aren't the same things that we get discouraged about as an older adult. I want to share a few things that just have discouraged me throughout my life. Starting out as a first grader, very first track meet that we were going to run at North Star Christian Academy. We all participated in the track at that time, and I don't even know that they had, in fact, I know that they didn't have a distinction between like the high school, the middle school, and the elementary. They just all ran as one. So a first grader generally didn't have a great chance against a high schooler to win the race. If you're chasing a toddler, sometimes they have a pretty good chance. First grader has a good chance at beating a 35-year-old, but not a teenager. So anyways, we were signing up for the different races, and I wanted to know what races I was allowed to run. I can see it like it was yesterday. Pastor Williams was down there at Miss Nay's desk, and he was filling out, and he didn't ask me what race I wanted to run. He just told me what races I was running, and one of those was the 100-meter dash. And I said, what kind of race is that? He said, it's short, and you'll do great. So I was excited. I thought, yeah, I will do great. So day of the track meet comes. I'm lined up, and of course, I think I was on the very end. I was like in lane number 9 or 10. I looked across at my competitors, some of which were high school-aged guys, and the gun went off, and I started running. And I just, at the track meet, or at the track there in Newberry, the 100-meter dash, as you run it, you get about halfway down the 100-meter dash, and there's all the bleachers on the right-hand side. So I'm running, I have my eyes closed for the first little bit, and I'm just running to beat the band, and I hear my name being cheered. Come on, Drew, you can do it. And I had been running for what seemed like forever. So I figured they're cheering for me. I must be doing well. I saw a few people in front of me, so I thought, which I never should have done, I wonder who's behind me. I looked back and there was nobody behind me. I was in last place. If I was a little bit older and a little smarter, I would have faked like I had hurt my leg, and that was the reason that I didn't. But it was pretty disappointing. I was pretty discouraged. I ran my other races as well, and I did my best, but my best was not enough to get. I think they gave you ribbons down to like 6th or 7th place. And I didn't get any ribbons. So on the way home, I was driving home with Mrs. Teed, and Gerald had won. He was in high school, and he had won several awards. And I remember thinking to myself, if I pout enough, maybe he'll feel sorry for me enough that he'll give me one of his ribbons. And so I pouted the whole way home. He never gave me a ribbon. They said, bye, have a good evening. And I got off the van, and I just felt yucky. I felt discouraged. I was a terrible runner, and that remained consistent throughout the rest of my high school career. That was discouraging. 2nd grade, Mrs. Bragg. Oh, Mrs. Bragg. She would come down the line. She was a volunteer help, and I think Mr. Bragg was he was a missionary builder. So they would come from time to time, help on different projects. And Mrs. Bragg, she would come and help in the school. And I remember a couple things distinctly about her. She was hunched over pretty hard, and she would come when it was my turn, and she'd help with penmanship and with reading. And she was very vigilant on the penmanship part. And I always hated when I saw Mrs. Bragg coming, because I knew what she was going to do, the same thing that she had done the day before. She was going to sit. We were going to share a seat. She sat half and half on my seat in my office there, and she was going to watch me write a word. Another thing that I know about Mrs. Bragg, she had terrible coffee breath, probably like I do now. So she'd watch me write the word, and I would write it as best I could, and then she would go, and then erase it. And I thought, so then I'd write it again, and she'd go, erase it. And that was discouraging to me. Maybe that should be more on a message about anger, because that was more angering than discouraging. But I always remember on my work thinking, oh, here comes Mrs. Bragg. I'm going to be stuck on this one page. She's going to go, and erase my paper. That was discouraging to a 2nd grader, right? Fifth grade, I remember we found out we were moving, and I was excited to move to Rogers City, but I also remember just kind of having feelings of like, this is weird. Why do I feel sad? Why do I feel we were moving away from the only place I had known, moving away from Grandma and Papa? And I remember being discouraged at times, thinking, man, I don't really like this. I don't know how I feel about this. Sixth grade, went from being the star soccer player at North Star because there weren't enough people to play soccer. So in third grade, I was starting on the high school team. And Mark Jr., they would take us I remember playing against Rogers City. We would play, and they would play until they would get 1 point away from mercying us. And then they would give us a goal so that they could score another goal, and they would just flirt with mercying us pretty much the entire game. And I thought I was awesome back there on the defense until I look back now and realize that I wasn't. My soccer career was very similar to my track career. But I remember I went from getting to play the whole game all the time at North Star, and then I came sixth grade. There were enough guys for the team. I still had not come into my own as an amazing soccer player, so I was on the sidelines. And I was discouraged that I never got to play. I thought, man, I practice, but I don't get to play, and I didn't like that. That was discouraging to me. 11th grade, we went to Canada on a big buck hunting trip. And to save you all the gruesome details, we missed a massive buck, like the one that's above my office, but probably even bigger than that. And that was super discouraging. That was the trip of a lifetime, buck of a lifetime. The gun didn't go off. That was, to an 11th grader, that was rock bottom. That was tough. That was discouraging. When I was a senior in college, I felt like the semester was not going to end. I was in my fourth and final semester doing student teaching, and very similar to Mrs. Bragg, Mrs. Flesher. You never knew when she was going to be in the class. You never knew when she was going to require you to teach for what counted. And my wife and I were engaged. We were going to be married as soon as the semester was done, and she was at home, and which meant that she wasn't there at college. And that was just kind of it seemed like a long, drug out few months of just work, Mrs. Flesher, teaching, work, and a bunch of the same. That was discouraging. I was ready for that part of my life to be over. I was ready to move on to the next chapter. Then I got married. Lenny said what I was not going to say. No, I'm just kidding. 2016. Thank you, Lenny. 2016. First year that we're married, first year here, there were times where because I had helped my parents in ministry, different things, I just assumed that I knew everything that there was about the ministry. So I figured, well, I'm going to come back and I'm just going to be this amazing help. And I'm going to, it wasn't that way. I know now that I know less about the ministry now than I thought I did when I was starting out 8 years ago. There was times where I would get discouraged because I would do something and it would either not be a help to mom and dad, or they would want it done a different way, and they would have to get on me as my boss and whatnot. And I just remember thinking, like, all I want to do is be a help. All I want to do is help the church go forward, and it seems like at every turn I'm not able to do that. And I just remember that was discouraging at times. I was frustrated. 2018, Kara going through infertility. And I remember the Lord had given me a peace about that, but it was a big deal to her. And I just remember at times her going through that, going to a baby shower, or hearing that someone else had gotten pregnant, and just watching her go through that process of grief and sadness. And I just remember being super discouraged because now, unlike not getting a ribbon at the first grade track meet, we're talking about real life stuff that actually matters, something over which I have no control. And now, I have a wife who's inconsolable. What do I tell her in that instance? I was discouraged. 2020, I had a heart to be a pastor, and every time that Dad would preach, literally the only thing that I could hear was just the Holy Spirit screaming in my ear. You need to preach. You can be a pastor. You can do this. And I tried to focus. All right, pay attention. Listen to what Dad's saying. I couldn't hear anything. But yet I wasn't a pastor. There really was no seeming end or opportunity for me to be a pastor here. And I didn't know where that was, what it was. And I was discouraged thinking God's really burdening me and calling me to something, but there really seems to be no opportunity to fulfill that. And I'm sure as I go along, there's going to be more things that cause discouragement in my life. But as I look back, I see that those things, big or small, at the time, those things were big things to me. Compared to the burden of a pastor or the difficulty of infertility or the things that you all have gone through in your lives that have caused discouragement, those things pale in comparison to Mrs. Bragg erasing my word or, you say, well, I wish that was the worst thing that happened to me in a day, right? Or not winning an award. It's not a sin to be discouraged, but discouragement can lead to the sin of fear or the sin of complacency or bitterness or anger or fill in the blank if we don't deal with it properly. So we're going to notice David here. He's in the cave and he's dealing with discouragement. And we're going to see what that looks like, and then we're going to see how he traveled the path of victory and freedom. So let's take a look at it. He was hiding very likely from Saul. This psalm would likely line up with the time of 1 Samuel chapter 22 through 24, where he would have been in hiding from Saul, where Saul was hunting him like an animal. David wasn't only in a cave, but he was discouraged. Look at verse 4. I looked on my right hand and beheld, but there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me. No man cared for my soul. So you can see here that David's feeling deserted. He's feeling alone. Notice this. Problems tend to isolate us. They make us feel as though we're the only ones in the problem. Nobody else understands, and no one really cares. Often that's what problems tend to do. When troubles come, rather than turning to God or family or friends or for love and support, often we turn to the nearest cave and we seek protection from the world and all of its questions and all the eyes that are looking on us while we're in the problem, right? Too often I watch believers and unbelievers alike who skip out on church when they get discouraged or when they're in a season of difficulty and problems. When they need the church the most, they attend the least. And you often see that and you wonder, well, hey, we see that when we're visiting some of the kids. Oh, hey, how come you weren't in church this week? Oh, well, we had a death in the family. Boy, that's the time where you need the love of God's people the most. Oh, Dad lost his job. Well, that's when you need the love and support from your church. You fill in the blank. For a difficulty, that's when we need God and His Word and His people the most. But often it's the opposite way, is it not? David not only felt discouraged and alone, but he also felt as though he hit rock bottom. Look at verse 6. Attend unto my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Not a person in the world that likes to feel like they have been brought low. You can think of maybe a time or a moment when you did something or said misspoke, or you did something that was just super embarrassing. I remember one time in high school, I was walking through the hallway and Dad and Mom were just laughing and a few other people were laughing as well. And I thought, well, what's so funny? Well, come to find out, I had something when playing football, someone had pulled at the pocket of my pants, and not just the pocket came off, the pants part came off as well. And I was walking through the hallway exposed. And I remember they were laughing, and I thought, well, this isn't very fun. It's not very fun to feel like you have that moment where you're brought low, right, where you're embarrassed. But beyond that, when you have that time when a great difficulty comes and you're brought low because of sin or because of loss or because of grief, nobody likes that feeling. It's important to remember that when we feel like we've hit rock bottom, whether that be because of a death or we got fired or because of medical things that are piling up or because of financial things that are piling up, there is never a pit that's too deep or a cave that's too dark for God's light to shine through. We're never going to get to a place where God can't reach us. Understanding this fact, understanding that God was going to be able to help David no matter where he was, no matter how low he had been brought, it allowed him to travel a path to liberty in his mind. He left us a roadmap to follow in this psalm. We're going to look at it. So, when you're discouraged, how can we encourage ourselves? Number one, first of all, we see that David verbalized his problems to God. He verbalized his problems. Have you ever asked yourself this question or thought, why should I go to God and tell him my problems? He already knows everything. I don't need to say those things. Or maybe you've said this or been taught this. I should only praise God. I should never go to God and tell him my problems or my difficulties because that would just be complaining or that would be discontentment. If those things were true, if God already knew everything and he didn't want us to verbalize our troubles, or if God didn't want us to come to him and tell us the difficulties of our lives, whatever those were, because he would feel as though those were complaining or us being discontent, then why did Peter say in 1 Peter 5:7, casting all your cares upon him, for he careth for you? Prayer should be a no holds barred, straight ahead communication with God. Maybe David was a man after God's own heart because he was willing to share his own heart with God. David poured out his heart and his feelings. We see it throughout the Psalms. Notice it in this Psalm, 142, verse 1. I cried unto the Lord with my voice unto the Lord that I make supplication. I poured out my complaint before him, verse 2. I showed before him my trouble. Verse 5, I cried unto thee, O Lord. Verse 6, attend unto my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutions, for they are stronger than I. Verse 7, bring my soul out of prison. There's really nothing positive there. Is David just sharing the things that were bothering him, sharing the things that were happening to him? Verbalize your troubles to God. Don't beat around the bush. Don't say, God, I'm going through a difficult time. Do you think he knows that? Do you think he can see all the things? He knows your thoughts. You're not hiding anything from him. Cut right to the root of the problem. Name names if you have to. Say, God, so-and-so is just giving me problems. So-and-so is making me angry. That might be your spouse. That might be your child. That might be a coworker, a boss, whoever. Just name names. Just get it off your chest, so to speak. Verbalize your problems. That's what David did. When we do this, we feel, Michael's just grinning and looking at his sister. I don't know what that's all about. When we do this, we feel an unburdening of ourselves. Well, we can cast our cares upon him because he cares for us, and he'll carry those things for us. We'll feel an unburdening, and we can share those things with God, who is the most faithful, loving friend that we could ever imagine or have. You say, oh boy, so-and-so, he's my best friend. He's not as good a friend as God. Or so-and-so, my girlfriend, she's there for me always. Oh, God's there for you always. God is listening. He cares, he responds, and you can tell him anything. Number 2, verbalize your problems. David recognized God's continual working. David recognized God's continual working. Verse 3, when my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then thou knewest my path. As David verbalized his problems, he realized something, that regardless of how he felt, God knew where he was at. And God was already working his sovereign plan. God is always working around us. God is always working around us. We say, God, will you come and meet with us? He's already here. God, will you go with me this week? He is. He already is going with you. You don't have to ask him to go with you. He said, I'll never leave you. He has the Holy Spirit inside of us. We don't have to ask him for him to meet with us. He's everywhere. We don't have to ask him to go with us. He is there. God is always working around us. The only times where we don't see God working is either when we're not looking for it, or maybe he's doing something that we don't maybe consider is what God is working, because it's not what we think he should be doing or when he should be doing it. God has the solution before we even know we have the problem. God is always working all things for our good, and we like to quote that, but that is not just a pie in the sky. Well, all things, we're going to have a wonder. Sometimes the things that God works in our lives at the time feel like trials, because they are, and difficulties, because they are. But God is working those things for our good. Every minute that David despaired because of the perceived lack of God's presence, God was right there, close as ever. Every second that David felt overwhelmed by his problems, God had already been busy dealing with the answer to those problems. David had to wait a little bit to become the king. David was anointed the king, and then he went through some odd circumstances, right, in his life. Some things that we wouldn't say, well, that doesn't seem like what the next king should have to go through, from Goliath to being hunted and chased where he's at now, to now he thought he was going to be the king over all Israel, but instead he's just king over Judah for 7.5 years. But God had a plan, and when you look back over David's life, you can see, oh, God knew exactly what he was doing. Number 3, not only did David verbalize his problems and recognize that God was constantly working around him, but number 3, David realized his provision from God. Verse 5, I cried unto thee, O Lord, I said, thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living. God was 2 things to David. He was a refuge. That's what we're talking about this evening. He was a safe place, a shelter. But also, David realized that God was his portion, which in the Hebrew, that word means my allotment. God was everything that he needed for him to live. The Bible is not written from this pie in the sky, or, written in poetic form for kind of an unattainable or really unapplicable, in an unapplicable way. The Bible was written to help you get through the difficulties of here and now. I'm going to use Ethan as an example. What time does your alarm clock go off tomorrow morning? 4:45. That's an early wake up. God wrote the Bible for you to help you for that early morning wake up. I'm guessing you don't jump out of bed at 4:30 before your alarm every morning. You probably uncrust your eyes at 4:47 after snooze, right? But God put things in promises in his word for strength for that early wake up. How long is your drive to work? 40 minutes. God put things in his word to help you and encourage you while you're spending that time alone, driving seemingly useless hours upon hours every week. How long do you work? 8-hour shift. And he does some tiring work at times. He's an electrician, so, electricians aren't always doing the heavy lifting, but I'm just kidding. But it's hard to put on that wire nut. It really, no. Works a long shift. God put things in his word for Ethan for tomorrow at work while he's working. Do you have like a perfect relationship always with your boss and your coworkers? So God put things in his word for you for how to deal with your boss and your coworkers. Is every relationship in your life just perfect? No issues whatsoever. God put things in his word for you for tomorrow for those things. Is your bank account always just completely full and flush with cash? No. Okay? Kids fall and break their arm, and that costs money. God put things in and promises in his word for you for that tomorrow. You come home to a wife and children who are eager to see you, and daddy, daddy, and all you want to do is lay face down on the floor and take a nap for like 2 hours because you just got up at 4:45 while they were still sleeping. God put things in his word to help you with that. And we could go on and on and on and on. The Bible is not just for when you need a difficulty. The Bible is for every day, just the mundane things of life. It's your portion. It's your allotment. God said this is for you to help you tomorrow. A wise pastor once said, there is no living in the land of the living like living in the living God. And we ought to do that. We don't just go to him when we have a difficulty. We don't come just on Sunday and say, ooh, that was good. Pastor, boy, he made me feel great. Well, Sunday morning probably didn't make it feel real great. That was not a real good, feel-good message. That one was kind of pointed. I didn't like that one a whole lot. But we don't come just on Sunday or on Wednesday to get a pat on the back and then we just go throughout our day. We ought to have this every day. That's what God has given it to us for. Lastly, let's review. David was discouraged. He verbalized his problems to God. He recognized God's working all around him, always, all the time. He realized that God was his refuge. He realized that God was his provision. After kind of understanding all of those things, what does David do? he really does the only thing that he could do after understanding all of those things. Verse 7, bring my soul out of prison that I may praise thy name. David resumes his praise. Once David understands the fact that he was discouraged, that God was his refuge, God was going to hide him better than any cave could, that God was his portion, that God was everything that he needed, he just began to praise God. David traveled from prison to praise in a cave of discouragement. And we can do the same thing. We can feel as though the situation in which we're in, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. There is no key to the cell. There is no way out. David felt that way. He was quite literally could not see light at the end of the tunnel, literally and figuratively. But he began to just kind of go through this progression. And at the end, he's praising God. And it only took him 7 verses. Then there's something else that I want to think about as well. This is Psalm 142. Doesn't mean necessarily that the Psalms were all written in chronological order, but if we were viewing it that way, Psalm 142 was written after Psalm 57. Maybe David, after he gets done writing these things in his journal, flips back as he's praising and starts looking at some of the different things that God had done for him. And he sees Psalm 57. And he remembers, oh, I was in a cave just like this. Maybe the very same cave, hiding from the very same king that's sitting on the very throne that I'm supposed to be sitting on at some point. And he reads through, and if you read Psalm 57 in parallel with Psalm 142, you'll see a lot of similarities. David verbalized his difficulties to God. David realized that God was working all around him. He realized that God was his refuge, his portion, and once he understood that, it didn't take away the difficulty. Saul was still after him. He was still in the cave, but it really changed his perspective on where he was and what God was doing in his life, and he began to praise God even in the discouragement, even in the difficulty. So I just want to encourage you with that thought, that God is our refuge, and you may be discouraged. And if you have the proper view on it, God's not just going to take everything away. Maybe he will, and that would be great. But a lot of times God doesn't want to remove the problem. He just wants us to be able to see him through the problem and see what he's doing. And that is what we can do, and it can really change our perspective while we're in a refuge during a discouragement.